A Moabite woman lies at the feet of an Israelite man on a threshing floor in the middle of the night. She's a foreigner, a widow, a woman from a nation so cursed that God himself said no Moabite could enter his assembly for 10 generations. 300 years of divine exclusion, written in stone, spoken by God. And this woman, this Moabite, this daughter of the cursed nation, will become the great-grandmother of King David, and through David's line, a direct ancestor of Jesus Christ. The Messiah's blood carries Moabite DNA. Now picture how that bloodline started. A dark cave in the mountains above the Dead Sea. The smell of sulfur still burning in the air. 2 cities reduced to ash in the valley below. A man so drunk he can't open his eyes, and his own daughter climbing on top of him. The same bloodline. From incest in a cave to the genealogy of the Son of God. How does that happen? How does the most cursed nation in the Bible produce the most important woman in the Messiah's ancestry? And here's the question that should disturb you more than the cave. God offered Moab restoration. He promised in Jeremiah 47 that he would restore the fortunes of Moab in the latter days. He promised. But when the time came for that promise to be fulfilled, there was no Moab left to restore. The entire nation had been erased from the earth, not conquered, not absorbed, erased, as if they had never existed, because Moab had 1,000 years to accept mercy, 1,000 years to turn from their gods to the God who made everything, 1,000 years of prophets, warnings, opportunities, and open doors, and they refused every single time. For 1,000 years. Today we're going to trace the most disturbing origin story in the Bible to the most persistent spiritual warfare ever waged against God's people, to the most complete national erasure in recorded history. This is the story of Moab, a nation born from shame that had every chance to be redeemed, but chose destruction instead. And their story is a warning, not for ancient civilization, for you. Because the mercy you're refusing today has an expiration date. And when it expires, there won't be enough of you left for God to restore. Let's go back 3,500 years. Sodom is gone. The sky behind them glows orange and black, a bruise spreading across the heavens. The air is thick with the stench of sulfur and burning stone, so dense it coats the inside of their throats. The ground shakes beneath their sandals as an entire civilization, 5 cities of the Jordan Plain, disappears into fire and smoke so intense that Abraham, standing 50 miles away, will look toward the sky the next morning and see smoke rising from the land like smoke from a furnace. Lot runs up the rocky slopes above Zoar with his 2 daughters. His wife is already a pillar of salt on the road behind them. She looked back. God said, "Don't look back." She looked back. One glance. One moment of partial obedience. One turn of the head toward what she was supposed to leave behind. And she became a monument. A permanent, crystallized reminder that God's instructions are not suggestions. That "don't look back" means don't look back. Remember that. Write it on something, because partial obedience becomes the defining pattern of everything that follows in this story. Lot and his 2 daughters scramble up the mountain. Their clothes still smell like Sodom. Their lungs are burning from the fumes. Their feet are bleeding on the sharp limestone. They find a cave, dark, damp. The walls drip with cold water. The distant rumble of destruction echoes through the rock, like the earth itself is groaning. 3 people huddle in the darkness. Everything they knew is gone. Their home, their neighborhood, their business, their mother and wife, standing somewhere below as a pillar of salt that the morning sun will illuminate like a gravestone. Picture what those first days in the cave were like. The daughters watching through the cave opening as smoke rose from the plains for days, the smell never quite leaving their clothes. The silence that followed the destruction, a silence so absolute it pressed against their eardrums like water. They believed they were the last humans alive. They were wrong. Zoar was right below them. Other settlements dotted the region. But trauma makes the world small. Fear draws the horizon close. And desperation doesn't research alternatives. In their minds, the human race was over, and its continuation depended entirely on them. The older daughter spoke first. Her logic was simple. Our father is old. There is no man around to give us children in the normal way. Let us get our father drunk with wine and lie with him, so we can preserve our family line through our father. Genesis 19, verse 32. No hesitation, no prayer. No moment of wrestling with the ethics of what she was proposing. Just a plan. And the plan required wine. It always requires wine in this story. Remember that. That night, they poured wine for their father. Not a cup. Enough to render him completely unconscious. The fermented smell filled the confined space of the cave, mixing with the lingering sulfur and the dampness of stone. The older daughter went in and lay with her intoxicated father. He was not aware of it when she lay down or when she got up. That's what the text said. He was not aware, completely unconscious. The wine had done its work so thoroughly that one of the most traumatic events imaginable registered as nothing. No memory, no awareness, nothing. The next morning, Lot woke with a crushing headache. His mouth tasted like stale wine and cave dust. His body ached in ways he couldn't explain. Something felt different about the cave, about the air, about his daughter's eyes. But the wine had erased the evidence from his memory, and whatever suspicion flickered in his mind was drowned by the convenience of not knowing. The older daughter told the younger, "It worked. Your turn." The second night, the same wine, more of it. Poured until Lot collapsed into unconsciousness again. The younger daughter's hands probably shook as she poured. She had watched her sister the night before. She knew what was coming. She knew what it would feel like. But the plan required 2 sons, not one. Insurance for the future of their bloodline. She went in. The same darkness, the same unconscious father, the same act that would echo through 1,000 years of history. Genesis 19. Verse 35. Again, he was not aware of it when she lay down or when she got up. 2 nights, 2 daughters. 2 acts that would create 2 nations, both carrying the mark of their origin in their blood and their names. 9 months later, the cave was different. Sunlight streamed through the opening. The older daughter held a crying newborn against her chest. The warm weight of him, the smell of fresh milk, life emerging from the darkest possible circumstance. She named him Moab, from father. She put the origin story in the name. She branded her son with the circumstances of his conception. Every person who ever called this child by name was pronouncing a one-word confession, from father. The younger daughter gave birth shortly after. She named her son Ben-Ami, son of my people, another name that told the truth just obliquely enough to sound noble if you didn't know the context. 2 boys, 2 nations, both conceived in darkness, wine, and transgression. And here is what most people miss. Lot was Abraham's nephew. He had walked with the father of faith from Mesopotamia to Canaan. He had been rescued by Abraham's army when Sodom was captured. He had entertained angels in his home. He had been personally saved from divine judgment by God's direct intervention. He knew God. His daughters knew about God. The door to faith was wide open. But knowledge of God and obedience to God are 2 different things. Lot chose Sodom's proximity. His wife chose Sodom's backward glance. His daughters chose their own plan over waiting for God's provision. 3 generations of partial obedience. Getting close to God, but never fully committing. Knowing the right direction, but looking back at the wrong one. And from that pattern, 2 nations were born. Both would have every opportunity to follow the God their ancestor had known. Both would refuse. For 1,000 years, Moab's descendants multiply across the highlands east of the Dead Sea. They build cities on elevated plateaus, where reddish sandstone rises against pale blue skies. They establish trade routes along the King's Highway, one of the most important commercial arteries in the ancient world. They develop agriculture on terraced hillsides carved from solid rock, where every drop of water is a treasure measured in survival. They herd sheep across sparse pastures, where yellowed grass bends under hot wind. The sound of bleating echoes against rocky canyon walls. Shepherds learn every hidden spring, every seasonal stream, every patch of vegetation that might sustain their flocks through one more season. They mine salt from the briny shores of the Dead Sea, loading heavy bundles onto camels that groan under the weight. They trade wool and salt along caravan routes that stretch from Arabia to Damascus. Merchants negotiate in stone-walled market squares, where the smell of animal sweat mixes with incense. They become a real nation, organized, fortified, prosperous by the standards of the ancient Near East. Their kings govern with centralized authority from cool stone halls, where deep voices discuss alliances and strategy. Their society divides into nobles, priests, shepherds, and craftsmen, with families gathered around crackling fires at night, sharing flatbread and telling ancestral stories. But at the center of their civilization, at the heart of their identity, they place a god named Chemosh, the destroyer, the subduer, a deity whose worship centered on blood, fire, and absolute domination. Think about what this choice meant. Lot had walked with Abraham. He had witnessed the power of the God who made the stars. He had been saved by that God from Sodom's destruction. His descendants knew about the God of Abraham. The testimony existed. The evidence was available. The door to faith in the true God was open. They walked past that door and chose a God carved from stone. And not just any stone god. They chose the one that demanded the highest price. Here is where the story gets dark, in ways that most Bible teachers won't describe. Chemosh worship included child sacrifice. This was not metaphorical. This was not symbolic. This was not a cultural misunderstanding exaggerated by hostile sources. Archaeologists have confirmed it across multiple sites in the ancient Near East. Charred infant bones at altar sites. Tiny skeletal remains with burn marks, consistent with deliberate immolation. Clay jars containing the ashes of babies mixed with sacrificial animal remains. The practice was real, and it was systematic. When Moab faced military crisis, when the crops failed, when drought pressed in, when the king needed supernatural intervention, the priests of Chemosh would call for the ultimate offering, a child. Usually a firstborn son. The bronze image of Chemosh would be heated with fire until the metal glowed red. Then the priests would beat drums and blow flutes, creating a wall of sound. The parents would bring their child. The baby would be placed in the heated arms of the idol, alive. The drums were there to drown out the screaming. 2 Kings chapter 3 verse 27 records one specific instance that made even Israel's army recoil. King Mesha of Moab, losing badly in a battle against a coalition of Israel, Judah, and Edom, took his firstborn son, the heir to his throne, the boy who was supposed to succeed him as king, and offered him as a sacrifice on the city wall. In full view of all three armies. The crackling of burning flesh mixing with a father's anguish and three nations' horror. The smell rising into the sky from a rooftop where a king burned his own son because his stone god demanded it. And this wasn't a one-time desperate act. This was the logical endpoint of Chemosh worship. A religion that begins by demanding animal blood always escalates. A god that feeds on death is never satisfied with less death. The appetite grows. The demands increase. The offerings must become more precious with each cycle. Animals first, then prisoners, then foreign children, then their own children. Each step seems like a small escalation from the step before. But the trajectory always leads to the same altar, with the same bronze arms and the same drums. Now let me draw the contrast that should shatter you. The God of Israel, when he tested Abraham's faith by asking for Isaac, stopped the sacrifice. He provided a ram caught in a thicket. He said, "Do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him." Abraham's hand was stayed. Isaac came down alive. God proved, in the foundational story of Israel's faith, that he never wanted child sacrifice. He wanted faith. He wanted trust. He wanted obedience that flowed from love and produced life, not obedience that flowed from terror and produced death. Abraham's God said, "Put down the knife. I have provided." Chemosh said, "Bring more children. The fire is hungry." This was the choice Moab made, not in ignorance, in full knowledge that an alternative existed. They could see Israel across the Jordan. They could hear the songs of a people whose God gave life instead of demanding it. And they chose Chemosh, the god who consumed their children and couldn't hear their prayers for 1,000 years. This is type refuse in its first and most devastating form. Not ignorance, not lack of exposure. Deliberate, informed, repeated rejection of available mercy. They knew, and they chose the fire anyway. 400 years pass after that cave. 400 years of Moabite civilization, building on a foundation of incest and false worship. 400 years of Chemosh temples growing taller, sacrificial fires burning hotter, and the distance from Abraham's God growing wider with every generation. And then Israel appeared on the horizon. 2 million people on the move. An entire nation migrating through the wilderness toward the land God had promised their ancestors. The dust cloud of their passage was visible for miles. At night, their campfires covered the plains like a second sky of stars on the ground. Moab's sentinels watched from the highland ridges. They crouched behind sun-heated rocks on the edge of the plateaus, counting campfires, estimating numbers, calculating the military implications of what they were seeing. What they saw terrified them. This wasn't a raiding party. This wasn't a seasonal migration. This was an entire civilization on the march, organized by tribes, carrying their God with them in a golden box at the center of their formation. And the reports coming back from other nations were worse than anything the sentinels could see with their own eyes. Egypt, the greatest military power on earth, destroyed. Their army drowned in a sea that had opened to let Israel walk through on dry ground, and then closed again on the pursuing chariots. The Amorites, Sihon, and Og, kings who had terrified the entire region, annihilated, their cities conquered, their lands distributed. Every nation that had stood in Israel's path had been removed from that path, not defeated, removed. And now the path led directly past Moab's border. King Balak, son of Zippor, saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites. Numbers 22 says Moab was filled with dread because of the Israelites. Indeed, Moab was filled with dread. That word dread in Hebrew carries the weight of existential terror, not the fear of losing a battle, the fear of ceasing to exist, the fear of being the next nation on the list of peoples that used to exist before Israel's God decided otherwise. Balak called his advisors into the cool stone halls of his palace. Voices echoed off limestone walls as they debated strategy. The smell of lamp oil hung heavy in the humid air. The military option was out. You don't fight the army whose God drowns the Egyptian military as a warm-up exercise. Balak needed a different kind of weapon, a supernatural one. He had heard of a prophet named Balaam, son of Peor, who lived near the Euphrates River, hundreds of miles to the north. Balaam's reputation was fearsome. Those you bless are blessed, and those you curse are cursed. A professional prophet whose words carried supernatural weight. Balak sent messengers, important men, Moabite elders, and Midianite officials. They rode swift camels across the desert, carrying heavy sacks of gold and silver, the fee for divination, the price for a professional curse. The message was desperate but dignified. A people has come out of Egypt. They cover the face of the land and have settled next to me. Now come and put a curse on these people, because they are too powerful for me, too powerful for me. A king admitting helplessness. A sovereign acknowledging that all his fortified cities, all his bronze swords, all his watchtowers and stone walls were worthless against a God who had already demonstrated what he thought of human military preparations at the bottom of the Red Sea. Balaam received the messengers. He looked at the gold. He heard the offer. And then he did something that most people miss. He consulted God, not Chemosh, not some local deity. The God of Israel, the creator of heaven and earth. Balaam had access to the real God. He knew how to hear from the Almighty. He was a prophet with genuine supernatural connection to the one true God. God's answer was immediate and clear. Do not go with them. You must not put a curse on those people, because they are blessed. Clear. Simple. Final. No ambiguity. No room for interpretation. Don't go. They're blessed. End of conversation. Balaam sent the messengers away. He told them plainly, that the Lord had refused to let him go with them. His voice was firm. His hands, however, were probably reluctant as they handed back the gold, because Balaam had seen how much gold was in those sacks. Balak didn't accept the refusal. Kings rarely do when their existence is at stake. He sent a second delegation, more prestigious princes, bigger sacks, a blank check. Do not let anything keep you from coming to me, because I will reward you handsomely and do whatever you say. Whatever you say. Name your price. An open-ended offer from a desperate king with access to a national treasury. And here is where partial obedience enters the story. At the prophetic level, Balaam had already received God's answer. It was no. Clear, definitive, final no. But the gold was heavier the second time. The princes were more important. The offer was more generous. So Balaam went back to God and asked again. Let that sink in. He already had the answer. God had already said no. But he went back and re-asked the same question, because the circumstances had changed in his favor. This is what negotiation with God looks like. I know you said no, but what if the payment is bigger? What if the opportunity is better? What if I promise to only do what you tell me? God said, fine, go with them, but only do what I tell you. The permission was conditional and tight. The leash was short. But Balaam saddled his donkey and headed toward Moab, with gold flickering in his imagination, and God's warning ringing in his ears. And God was angry. The text says explicitly in Numbers 22, verse 22, God was very angry when Balaam went. He gave permission and was angry. Why? Because the permission was a test, not an endorsement. God allowed the journey precisely because he was going to use it to demonstrate something about the difference between obedience and opportunity. Just because God opens a door doesn't mean he's happy you walked through it. Sometimes he opens the door so you can see what's on the other side and choose correctly. Balaam chose the gold. And on the road to Moab, God sent an angel with a drawn sword to show Balaam what choosing gold over obedience actually looks like up close. An angel of the Lord stood in the road with a drawn sword. The donkey saw the angel. Balaam did not. Think about that. The animal could see what the prophet couldn't. The beast of burden had better spiritual vision than the man who made his living hearing from God. The donkey swerved off the road into a field. Balaam beat the donkey to get it back on the path. The angel appeared again in a narrow passage between two vineyard walls. The donkey pressed against the wall, crushing Balaam's foot against the stone. Balaam beat the donkey again, harder. The angel appeared a third time in a place so narrow there was no room to turn. The donkey lay down under Balaam, and Balaam beat the donkey with his staff 3 times. 3 refusals to see what was right in front of him. 3 beatings of the only creature in the scene with enough sense to stop. The pattern. 3 times God blocked the path. 3 times Balaam forced his way forward. 3 times the donkey saw what the prophet was too blind or too greedy to see. Then God opened the donkey's mouth. What have I done to you to make you beat me these 3 times? And Balaam the prophet, the man who heard from God, the seer whose blessings and curses moved nations, answered the donkey. He argued with it. He told the donkey it had made a fool of him. He said if he had a sword, he would kill it right now. He was so blinded by his own agenda that he didn't even pause to wonder why his donkey was talking. Let that sink in. A donkey speaks in human language, and the prophet's response is annoyance, not awe. This is what greed does. This is what partial obedience does. It makes you so focused on your own plan that you can't recognize the supernatural when it speaks to you in plain language from the mouth of an animal. Then God opened Balaam's eyes, and he saw the angel, flaming sword, terrifying presence, standing directly in his path. He fell face down. The angel told him, "Your path is a reckless one before me. If the donkey had not turned away, I would certainly have killed you by now. But I would have spared the donkey. The donkey was wiser than the prophet. The donkey would have lived. The prophet would have died." This is one of the most humiliating rebukes in all of Scripture. God telling a renowned prophet that his donkey has better judgment than he does. Balaam arrived in Moab. Balak met him with altars and sacrifices ready. 7 altars, 7 bulls, 7 rams, the number of divine completeness. Weaponized for manipulation. Balaam opened his mouth to curse Israel, and blessings came out instead. 3 times, Balak positioned Balaam on different mountains overlooking Israel's camp. 3 times, Balaam built altars and offered sacrifices. 3 times, Balaam opened his mouth, and 3 times, God put words of blessing where Balak had paid for curses. How can I curse those whom God has not cursed? How can I denounce those whom the Lord has not denounced? Balak was furious. He stamped his feet. He clapped his hands in rage. I brought you to curse my enemies, but you have done nothing but bless them. 3 blessings instead of 3 curses. 3 confirmations that you cannot buy your way around God's will. 3 proofs that divine purpose overrides human gold. But then Balaam did something that is almost worse than cursing. He couldn't curse Israel supernaturally, so he gave Balak a strategy to corrupt Israel from within. If you can't curse them from outside, send your daughters to seduce them from inside. This is where the Moabites discovered their most devastating weapon. Not swords, not chariots, not siege engines, not supernatural curses. Women. When every divine attempt to curse Israel failed, when 3 mountaintops of altars and sacrifices produced nothing but blessings, when all the gold in Moab's treasury couldn't buy a single word of damnation against God's people, someone in Balak's war council proposed a different strategy. If you can't destroy them from outside, destroy them from within. If you can't curse their God, corrupt their men. If spiritual warfare doesn't work, try carnal warfare. Tradition and the book of Numbers suggest that this strategy came from Balaam himself. The prophet who couldn't curse Israel taught Moab how to make Israel curse itself. Moabite women were prepared, dressed in flowing, colorful fabrics that caught the desert wind, adorned with jingling jewelry that gleamed in the sunlight, perfumed, smiling, carrying food, and of course, wine. Wine, again. The same substance that had conceived their nation in Lot's cave now became the instrument of their most successful military campaign. The same liquid that had rendered their ancestor unconscious now flowed into the cups of Israelite soldiers around evening campfires. These women descended from the Moabite highlands toward the Israelite camp at Shittim. They weren't carrying swords. They were weapons carrying themselves. They came as neighbors, as friends, as generous hosts, inviting weary travelers to a celebration. Come to our festival. We have food. We have wine. We have music. You've been walking through the desert for decades. When was the last time you celebrated anything? The invitation sounded innocent. What could be wrong with attending a community gathering? What harm could come from accepting hospitality from neighbors? The Israelite men went. First a few, then more. Then crowds. The festivals were held at elevated sites where Moabite gods were worshipped. The food was sacrificial food, offered first to Baal of Peor before being served to guests. The wine flowed freely. The music played. The Moabite women danced. And somewhere between the first cup of wine and the last, between the first laugh and the last embrace, the Israelite men found themselves doing things their fathers would have died rather than do. Numbers 25 records it with devastating bluntness. While Israel was staying in Shittim, the men began to indulge in sexual immorality with Moabite women, who invited them to the sacrifices to their gods. The people ate the sacrificial meal and bowed down before these gods. So Israel yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor. Read that progression carefully. It's the anatomy of every spiritual seduction that has ever worked. Step 1. Social connection. Come to dinner. Step 2. Physical intimacy. They indulged in sexual immorality. Step 3. Religious compromise. They attended the sacrifices. Step 4. Participation in worship. They ate the sacrificial meal. Step 5. Complete capitulation. They bowed down. From come to dinner to bow before my God in 5 steps. Nobody starts at step 5. Nobody walks up to a faithful person and says, "Would you like to commit idolatry today?" They say, "Would you like some wine?" and the Lord's anger burned against Israel. A plague erupted in the camp. Bodies fell with burning fever. Groans of pain echoed through trembling tents. Families watched their men collapse. Children cried over fathers who had been healthy that morning and dead by evening. God told Moses to execute the ringleaders. Put to death those who have yoked themselves to Baal of Peor. Hang them in broad daylight before the Lord. While this was happening, while the entire community was weeping at the entrance of the tent of meeting, while thousands were dying and leaders were being executed, an Israelite leader named Zimri did something so brazen it defies comprehension. He walked through the camp in full view of everyone, with a Midianite woman named Cosby on his arm, and went into his tent, while people were dying outside, while the community was in mourning, while God's judgment was actively falling on the nation. He paraded his defiance in front of the weeping crowd, and went into his tent to do exactly what had caused the plague. Phinehas, grandson of Aaron the high priest, saw it. He didn't convene a committee. He didn't suggest counseling. He didn't propose a waiting period or a reconciliation process. He grabbed a spear. He followed them into the tent, and he drove the weapon through both of their bodies with a single thrust. The plague stopped. Numbers 25, verse 9. Those who died in the plague numbered 24,000. 24,000. Not 24,000 soldiers killed in battle by foreign swords. 24,000 Israelites killed by divine judgment because they accepted dinner invitations from Moabite women. 24,000 families destroyed. 24,000 futures ended. 24,000 consequences of the strategy that began with, "Would you like some wine?" One act of total, uncompromising obedience from Phinehas stopped what total compromise had unleashed. And God honored Phinehas with a covenant of lasting priesthood, because he was as zealous for my honor among them as I am. The weapon that Balaam couldn't deliver through supernatural curses from 3 mountaintops, Moabite women delivered through wine cups at dinner parties. Moab had discovered something more effective than any army. If you can't destroy God's people through force, seduce them through friendship. If you can't curse them from outside, corrupt them from within. And for this, for weaponizing their daughters, for turning hospitality into spiritual assassination, for engineering the greatest single-day loss of Israelite life outside of military battle, God pronounced a curse that would last 10 generations. But the foundational charge wasn't even the seduction. It was simpler than that. Deuteronomy 23, verses 3 and 4. No Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord, not even in the 10th generation. For they did not come to meet you with bread and water on your way when you came out of Egypt. And they hired Balaam to pronounce a curse on you. They didn't bring bread and water. That's the root charge. Before the curses, before the seduction, before the 24,000 dead. When Israel was hungry and thirsty, passing through the wilderness, Moab had bread. Moab had water. Moab could see a nation of refugees struggling past their border, and they refused to help. Then they tried to curse them. Then they sent their daughters. But it started with the refusal to share bread and water. This is what type refuse looks like in its most basic form. Not an act of violence, an act of withholding, not doing something terrible, refusing to do something simple. God judges what you refuse to give as severely as what you actively take. The mercy you withhold is counted as rebellion. God did not destroy Moab immediately. This is the detail that makes Moab's story not just tragic, but inexcusable. Between the sin of Baal Peor and Moab's final erasure, centuries passed. Not years, not decades, centuries. Centuries of prophets delivering warnings. Centuries of opportunities to change course. Centuries of divine patience extended to a nation that had earned judgment many times over. Think about what this patience cost God. Every year that Moab continued to sacrifice children to Chemosh, God could have stopped it by destroying them. Every year that Moab continued to seduce Israel into idolatry, God could have eliminated the source. Every year that Moab mocked God's people and rejected God's mercy, God could have ended the conversation permanently. Instead, he sent messengers. Isaiah prophesied first. His oracle against Moab fills 2 entire chapters, 15 and 16. And the prophecy begins with breathtaking specificity. A prophecy against Moab. Ar in Moab is ruined, destroyed in a night. Kir in Moab is ruined, destroyed in a night. 2 cities named, 2 destructions promised. A timeline given. It will happen in a single night, not a prolonged siege, not a slow decline. Overnight devastation. But Isaiah's prophecy wasn't all judgment. Woven into the language of destruction is a remarkable emotion. Isaiah 16, verse 11. My heart laments for Moab like a harp, my inmost being for Kir Hareseth. God is lamenting. Through Isaiah, God expresses grief over what is coming. He doesn't enjoy the destruction of the wicked. He takes no pleasure in the elimination of peoples. He mourns what could have been if they had chosen differently. And then Isaiah reveals Moab's fatal spiritual pattern. When Moab appears at her high place, she only wears herself out. When she goes to her shrine to pray, it is to no avail. She only wears herself out, praying to Chemosh, sacrificing to a statue that can't hear, can't speak, can't move, can't save, pouring out wine on heated stones and listening to the hiss of evaporation, which sounds exactly like what it is, nothing. Generations of Moabites climbing to high places, bringing their best offerings, sacrificing their most precious possessions, even their own children, and receiving absolutely nothing in return, just the sizzle of wine on stone and the silence of a God who was never there. Jeremiah delivered an even more extensive oracle, all of chapter 48, 47 verses of specific, detailed, city-by-city judgment, the longest prophetic oracle against any single foreign nation in Jeremiah's entire book. Nebo will be ruined. Kiriathaim will be disgraced and captured. Heshbon will be plotted against. The horn of Moab has been cut off. His arm is broken. City after city after city. Named, sentenced, scheduled for destruction. As if God were reading a list of addresses, each one marked for demolition. And then Jeremiah uses the wine metaphor that connects everything in Moab's story. Chapter 48, verse 11. Moab has been at rest from youth, like wine left on its dregs, not poured from one jar to another. She has not gone into exile, so she tastes as she did, and her aroma is unchanged. Wine, again. The substance follows them like a fingerprint, from origin to obituary. In winemaking, young wine is poured from one vessel to another to separate it from the sediment that accumulates at the bottom. This process, called racking, clarifies the wine. It removes impurities. It refines the flavor. Wine that is never racked, that sits too long on its own sediment, doesn't improve. It stagnates. It absorbs the bitterness of its own dregs. Eventually, it turns to vinegar, sour, unusable, fit only to be discarded. Moab had never been refined. They had never allowed adversity to separate them from their impurities. They had avoided the disruption that refines character, the pain that purifies faith, the crisis that forces a choice between who you are and who God wants you to be. And so they remained on their dregs, unrefined, stagnant, slowly souring into something that could not be used for any good purpose. Amos added his voice in chapter 2. For 3 sins of Moab, even for 4, I will not relent, because he burned to lime the bones of Edom's king. The mathematical precision of this prophecy is chilling. 3 sins, then 4. This wasn't impulsive judgment. This was accumulated, measured, patient, divine response to sins that had been cataloged and numbered. God was keeping count, and the count had reached its limit. The specific crime that tipped the scale: burning a king's bones to lime, using human remains as construction material, not just killing your enemies, but desecrating their dead, grinding their bones into powder, and mixing it into the mortar of your building, so that you literally built your civilization on the remains of the people you had destroyed. That level of cruelty demonstrated hearts hardened beyond the reach of normal moral feeling, consciences seared so thoroughly that the most basic human decency, respect for the dead, had been burned away along with the bones. Ezekiel added the final charge. Ezekiel 25, verse 8. Because Moab said, "Look, Judah has become like all the other nations. This was spoken when Jerusalem fell, when the temple burned, when God's people were marched into Babylonian exile, their holy city in flames behind them. Moab watched Israel's darkest hour and laughed. They pointed at God's disciplined children and said, "See, their God abandoned them just like we always knew he would. They're no different from us." Their covenant was worthless. This was the final mistake, the one God would not overlook. Because God disciplines his children without abandoning them. He corrects his family without destroying them. Israel's exile was temporary, a 70-year correction, followed by restoration and return. But God destroys his enemies without hope of restoration. And by mocking Israel's discipline, by celebrating God's correction as if it were God's abandonment, Moab revealed that they had fundamentally misunderstood the difference between being a child who is corrected and being an enemy who is eliminated. They thought God's discipline of Israel proved God was weak. In reality, it proved God was a father. And fathers who correct their children are infinitely more dangerous to the enemies of those children than absentee gods who never respond at all. Prophet after prophet, warning after warning, century after century, opportunity after opportunity, and Moab refused every single time. For 1,000 years, until there were no more prophets left to send, and no more patience left to extend. The Assyrians came first, row upon row of armored soldiers marching in synchronized formation across the Moabite plateau, bronze shields catching desert sunlight like a river of fire, spear points creating a forest of iron above their heads, the ground trembling under their boots, dust clouds marking their approach from miles away, war chants echoing off canyon walls before the armies were even visible. The sound alone was enough to break morale. The thud of 10,000 feet hitting earth in unison, the creak of siege engines being wheeled into position, the whistle of the first volley of arrows darkening the sky. Moab's stone walls, the fortifications their ancestors had built stone by stone over generations, crumbled under Assyrian battering rams in days. The thick gates that had made them feel invulnerable exploded inward with a sound like thunder. Citizens who had never imagined the inside of their own walls could be reached now ran through streets where death flew on iron points and wooden shafts. Moabite kings who had commanded from elevated thrones fled through dark canyons in torn robes, their crowns abandoned, their royal dignity reduced to the distance they could run before their legs gave out. The humiliation that followed was worse than the destruction. Moabite nobles knelt in the dust before foreign conquerors. They offered tribute in gold and silver, each coin representing a piece of their national soul being purchased for the privilege of continued existence. But Moab survived the Assyrians, diminished, humiliated, vassalized, but alive. And here is where the mercy that Moab doesn't deserve appears in the story. Because survival after Assyrian conquest was not guaranteed. Plenty of nations were completely destroyed by Assyria. The populations deported, their cities razed, their identities erased. Moab survived, not because they were strong, because God was patient. The survival was itself an opportunity, a chance to see Assyrian destruction as a warning, and turn from Chemosh to the God who actually controlled the outcomes of battles. They didn't take it. The Babylonians came next. Nebuchadnezzar's armies were even more thorough than the Assyrians. What the Assyrians had damaged, the Babylonians finished. Lit torches set wooden structures ablaze. Flames crackled high in the night sky, visible for miles across the Dead Sea basin. Buildings that had sheltered Moabite families for centuries collapsed in showers of sparks. Market squares, where merchants had haggled over wool and salt, became blackened wastelands. Temple columns that had held up Chemosh's sanctuaries for generations toppled with thunderous crashes, bringing stone gods down with them in a cascade of rubble and dust. The survivors were chained. Cold iron links that bit into wrist and ankle marched in long columns toward Babylon. Each step away from the highlands was a step away from everything that had made them who they were. But here is the critical difference. The difference between a nation that survives exile and a nation that doesn't. When Israel went into Babylonian exile, they carried something Moab did not possess. They carried a covenant. They carried scriptures. They carried the words of prophets who had told them this exile would happen and that it would end. They carried the promise of Jeremiah that after 70 years, God would bring them home. They carried identity that was rooted in something deeper than geography. So when Israelite children were born in Babylon, their parents taught them Hebrew, told them the stories, sang them the songs, read them the scrolls, reminded them daily who they were and whose they were. 70 years later, when Cyrus issued his decree, Israel went home, their identity intact, their faith preserved, their covenant unbroken. Moab had none of this. When Moabite families arrived in Babylon, they had nothing to hold on to. Their god, Chemosh, had been proven powerless. His temples were rubble. His image was a piece of broken stone in the debris of a conquered city. There were no Moabite scriptures to preserve. No Moabite prophets who had predicted this exile and promised return. No Moabite covenant that defined who they were apart from where they lived. Within one generation, Moabite children spoke Aramaic instead of Moabite. Within 2 generations, they married Babylonian spouses and worshipped Babylonian gods. Within 3 generations, the word Moabite meant nothing. It was a footnote, a half-remembered family story that the grandchildren found embarrassing and the great-grandchildren never heard. The language died. The customs dissolved. The genealogies crumbled into illegible fragments. The names that had carried meaning for 40 generations became meaningless syllables scattered across foreign lands. And the silence settled over the highlands east of the Dead Sea, over the empty cities, over the crumbling walls and roofless palaces. Owls nested in throne rooms. Sand drifted through doorways. Wind whistled through gaps in masonry that no one would ever repair. Travelers crossing the plateau didn't even know they were walking through the grave of a civilization. They felt the sting of wind-driven sand against their skin, but they didn't realize they were being pelted with the pulverized remains of a people who had existed for 1,000 years, and then simply stopped. And here is the most devastating line in Moab's entire obituary. Jeremiah 49, verse 6. Yet afterward, I will restore the fortunes of Moab, declares the Lord. God promised restoration after everything. After the cave, after Chemosh, after the child sacrifices, after the seduction at Shittim, after the mocking of Judah, after 1,000 years of persistent, deliberate, informed refusal of available mercy. God still offered to bring them back. But when afterward arrived, there was no Moab to restore. The promise hung in the air over empty highlands. The door stood open in front of a nation that no longer existed. Not because God withdrew the offer, because Moab's refusal had been so complete, so persistent, so thoroughly woven into their identity, that by the time restoration was available, there was nothing left to restore. This is the ultimate consequence of type refuse. Not that God won't forgive. He will. Not that God won't restore. He offered to. But that by the time you finally run out of chances to refuse, you've already refused yourself into non-existence. And promises meant for you echo over empty ground where you used to be. In the middle of this 1,000-year story of refused mercy, there is one woman, Ruth. She was Moabite, born into the cursed nation, raised under Chemosh's shadow, educated in a culture that sacrificed children and seduced enemies. She married an Israelite man named Mahlon, who had come to Moab with his family during a famine. When Mahlon died, Ruth was left as a widow in a foreign family, with a grieving mother-in-law named Naomi. Naomi decided to go back to Israel. She told her daughters-in-law to return to their Moabite families, to go back to their Moabite gods, to resume their Moabite lives. Orpah kissed Naomi goodbye and went home, back to Moab, back to Chemosh, back to the nation that was heading toward total erasure. Ruth refused to go back. Ruth 1:16. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. This is complete conversion, not partial. Not, I'll keep my Moabite identity and add your God to my collection. Not, I'll go with you but maintain my option. Complete. Total. Irreversible. Your people. Your God. your burial ground, your everything. Ruth abandoned Moab entirely. She didn't negotiate what she could keep. She didn't ask for exceptions. She didn't try to blend her Moabite heritage with Israelite worship. She walked away from everything she knew and became something entirely new. And God rewarded that complete commitment with an extraordinary destiny. Ruth married Boaz. She gave birth to Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. Jesse fathered David, a Moabite woman from the nation God cursed for 10 generations. In the direct bloodline of Israel's greatest king and the Messiah of the world, the same blood that cursed a nation blessed the Savior. How? Why? Because Ruth did what her nation refused to do. She accepted the mercy that was available. She chose the God of Abraham over the God of Chemosh. She traded the familiar comfort of a dying civilization for the terrifying uncertainty of complete obedience. Moab said no to God for 1,000 years and got erased. Ruth said yes to God in a single moment and got placed in the genealogy of Jesus Christ. That's the math. That's the equation. That's the difference between refused mercy and accepted grace. One woman, one decision, one sentence. Your God will be my God. Everything else was details. Let me show you something about this story that connects everything from the cave to the cross. Wine. Wine made Lot unconscious in the cave where Moab was conceived. Wine was poured as libation over Chemosh's hot altars in Moab's temples, hissing as it evaporated into nothing, offered to a god who wasn't there. Wine was carried by Moabite women into the Israelite camp at Shittim, poured into the cups of men who would bow before Baal of Peor by morning. Wine was the metaphor Jeremiah used for Moab's stubbornness, settled on its dregs, never refined, turning to vinegar. And wine was poured at the Last Supper by a descendant of Ruth, the Moabite. When Jesus took the cup and said, "This is my blood of the new covenant, poured out for the forgiveness of sins," the substance that conceived a cursed nation became the symbol of universal salvation through that same nation's one faithful daughter. Wine made Lot fall. Wine corrupted Israel. Wine represented Moab's stagnation. And wine became the blood of redemption. God took the darkest symbol of Moab's story and redeemed it into the most sacred symbol of the Christian faith. That's not coincidence. That's authorship. That's a God who writes stories so complex that the same element means destruction in one chapter and salvation in another. And it all hinges on one variable: acceptance or refusal. Lot's daughters used wine to take what wasn't given. Moab's priests used wine to worship what wasn't real. Moab's women used wine to seduce what wasn't theirs. Jesus used wine to give what nobody deserved. Same substance, opposite response to God, opposite outcome for eternity. Now let me bring this to you, and I need you to stay with me here, because everything I've said for the last hour has been building to this moment. This is where the story of an ancient nation becomes the mirror that shows you your own face. Moab's story is not ancient history. It's a diagnosis, because the defining characteristic of Moab wasn't their origin. They didn't choose to be conceived in incest. They didn't choose to carry that mark on their bloodline. Nobody chooses the circumstances of their birth. What they chose was what they did with the mercy that was offered to them afterward. And every person listening to this right now has the same choice in front of them, not the exact same circumstances. You probably weren't born in a cave above the Dead Sea, but you were born into a broken world with a broken nature and a gravitational pull toward every wrong direction. You were born with Moab's tendency. The tendency to know God is available and choose Chemosh anyway. The tendency to see mercy on the table and walk past it. The tendency to hear the truth and negotiate it into something more comfortable. And God has offered you the same thing he offered Moab: mercy, restoration, a way back from whatever cave your story started in. The question is not whether the mercy is available. It has always been available. It was available to Moab's first generation, and it's available to you right now. The question is whether you'll accept it or refuse it. And here's what Moab teaches you about the mechanics of refusal. It doesn't happen dramatically. Nobody wakes up one morning and announces, "Today I'm going to reject God's mercy permanently and disappear from history." That's not how it works. It happens gradually, invisibly, one small no at a time. The first generation of Moabites looked at the God of Abraham and the god Chemosh and made a choice. Just one choice, one decision point, one fork in the road where they went left instead of right. That single decision didn't feel catastrophic at the time. It felt cultural. It felt practical. It felt like maintaining their independence and establishing their own identity. But it set a trajectory, and the second generation was born into that trajectory. They grew up in Chemosh's shadow. They thought altars of child sacrifice were normal because they'd never seen anything else. They didn't actively refuse mercy so much as inherit their parents' refusal and assume it was just how life worked. The third generation built the temples bigger. The fourth generation hired Balaam. The fifth generation weaponized their daughters. The sixth generation burned their children. Each generation compounded the refusal of the one before it. Each generation's normal was one step further from God than the previous generation's extreme. And by the time you're 20 generations deep into accumulated refusal, the distance from God is so vast that you can't even see him from where you're standing. You can't hear his prophets because their language sounds foreign to ears that have only heard Chemosh's drums. This is what's happening right now. Not in ancient Moab. In your life, you're somewhere on that progression. Maybe you're in the early stages, where the refusal still feels like a personal choice you can reverse anytime you want, where the distance from God still feels manageable, where later still sounds reasonable, or maybe you're further along. Maybe the compromises have accumulated. Maybe the small refusals have built up like sediment until your spiritual arteries are almost completely blocked. Maybe you've said "not yet" so many times that it's become your default setting, the automatic response that fires before you even think about it. Or maybe, and this is the one that should terrify you, you don't even recognize the refusal anymore. Maybe it's so normal, so habitual, so deeply woven into the fabric of your daily life that it doesn't register as a choice. It just feels like who you are. That's where Moab was in its final generations. Refusal had become identity. Saying no to God wasn't a decision, it was an instinct. And when a nation's identity is refusal, there's nothing left to save when judgment arrives. Here's the specific question I need you to answer right now. What mercy are you refusing? Not what mercy did you refuse 5 years ago. What mercy are you refusing today? This week? This month? Is it the conviction you felt in that conversation that you immediately rationalized away? Is it the relationship God told you to pursue or to end, and you've been pretending you didn't hear? Is it the generosity God placed on your heart that you calculated out of because the numbers didn't make sense? Is it the apology you know you owe that you've been postponing because pride tastes better than humility? Is it the surrender God has been asking for? The one area of your life you've been holding back. The 99th sheep you refuse to bring into the fold because it's the one you enjoy most. Is it the bread and water you're withholding from someone who needs it? Because that's how God measured Moab. Not by the grand gestures of defiance, by the bread and water they refuse to share. Every day you withhold what God tells you to give, whether it's forgiveness or generosity or time or surrender. You're adding another generation to your personal history of refusal. You're building another layer of sediment. You're settling deeper into your own dregs. And Jeremiah's metaphor applies to you the same way it applied to Moab. Wine left on its dregs too long turns to vinegar. It doesn't get better with time. It gets worse. It gets sour. It becomes something that can't be used for its intended purpose. Each refusal makes the next refusal easier. Each "not yet" builds a wall between you and the mercy that's being offered right now, right this moment, while you still have the ability to accept it. And there will come a point where later becomes never. Not because God withdraws the offer. God promised restoration, even to Moab, but because there won't be enough of you left to accept it. Because your identity will have become your refusal. Because the sediment will have hardened into stone. Because the vinegar will be all that's left of what was once wine. And God's promise of restoration will echo over the empty space where you used to be. Moab had 1,000 years. Let that number settle on you. 1,000 years of available mercy. 1,000 years of prophets knocking on the door. 1,000 years of warnings invitations, second chances, third chances, 100th chances, 1,000 years. How many years do you have? I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to wake you up. Because time is the one resource that feels infinite when you have it, and devastating when it runs out. Moab's first generation thought they had time. So did the 5th. So did the 15th. So did the 30th generation, standing in their crumbling cities, still burning children on Chemosh's altar, still confident that tomorrow would look like today. The last Moabite who ever lived didn't know they were the last Moabite who would ever live. They probably thought they'd have one more chance, one more year, one more season to make a different choice. There wasn't. How many warnings have you already received? How many prophets have spoken into your life? How many sermons have you sat through? How many conversations have convicted you? How many books have opened your eyes? How many quiet moments in the middle of the night has the still, small voice said something your morning routine drowns out? How many times has a Balaam's donkey moment happened right in front of you? A clear, unmistakable, supernatural interruption that you beat with a stick and forced past because you were too focused on your own destination to see what God was blocking. The donkey was wiser than the prophet. Is something in your life wiser than you? Moab's defining sin wasn't idolatry. Other nations committed idolatry and survived. Nineveh committed worse and repented in sackcloth and was spared. Moab's defining sin wasn't even child sacrifice, as horrifying as that was. Moab's defining sin was the refusal of available mercy. Consistent, persistent, generation after generation rejection of a God who kept extending his hand long after any rational observer would have pulled it back. God kept offering. Moab kept refusing. Until the offering expired, and the refusal was all that remained. They didn't bring bread and water. They had it. They saw the need. They had the capacity to help, and they withheld it. Then they hired a prophet to curse the people they'd refused to feed. Then they sent their daughters to corrupt the men they'd refused to welcome. Then they sacrificed their children to a God who couldn't hear them, while the God who had been speaking to them for 1,000 years went unanswered. You have bread. You have water. You have mercy that's been given to you freely. And somewhere in your life, you're withholding it from someone else, or refusing to accept it for yourself. Maybe it's forgiveness. Someone wronged you, and you're holding on to the injury, like a Moabite holding on to Chemosh, convinced that your anger is justified, convinced that letting go would be weakness, while the unforgiveness turns to vinegar in your soul. Maybe it's generosity. God prompted you to give, and you calculated yourself out of it. You ran the numbers and decided that obedience didn't make financial sense. You kept the bread and water because you might need them later. Maybe it's surrender. There's one area of your life that you fenced off from God's authority. One room with a locked door. One habit, one relationship, one ambition, one comfort that you've declared exempt from divine inspection. Maybe it's the call itself, the assignment God gave you that you've been negotiating with for years, the thing he told you to do that you've been finding creative reasons to postpone, the Moabite strategy of saying later until later becomes never. Whatever it is, it has a name. You know its name. You've known it for a while, and every day you don't address it, you add another layer of sediment, another generation of refusal, another step on the progression that leads from not yet to too late. Ruth left Moab, and everything changed. She didn't negotiate. She didn't ask for a modified version of obedience. She didn't try to bring Chemosh along as a backup option. She said, "Your God is my God, period." And God took a woman from the most cursed bloodline in the Bible and put her in the ancestry of his own son. That's what complete acceptance of mercy does. It doesn't just save you. It redeems everything about your story. The cave, the wine, the curse, the shame. All of it gets woven into a narrative so much bigger than your worst chapter that the worst chapter becomes a footnote in the story of redemption. But Ruth only got there because she did what her entire nation refused to do. She accepted what was offered completely, without reservation, without negotiation. Your people, Your God. Your everything. So here's the final question. What mercy are you refusing right now? What bread and water are you withholding from someone who needs it? What Chemosh are you still sacrificing to, while the God of Abraham stands at your border, offering everything you need? What dregs are you settling into, while God is trying to pour you into a new vessel and refine you into something that actually has value? What later is silently becoming never, while you congratulate yourself on keeping your options open? Moab had 1,000 years. Ruth had one moment. 1,000 years of refusal produced total erasure. One moment of acceptance produced the bloodline of the Messiah. The math is simple. The choice is clear. The door is open, but it won't be open forever. Because the same God who promised restoration for Moab in the latter days will keep his promise. But a promise can only be received by someone who still exists. And you are still here, right now. Listening. Alive. With breath in your lungs and a choice in front of you. Take it. Don't be Moab. Be Ruth. Don't refuse the mercy. Accept it. Completely. Today. Not later. Not eventually, not mostly, completely. Because the door has hinges, and you don't know when it swings shut. If this message hit you somewhere real, if you felt something shift while you were listening, I want you to do 3 things. First, share this with someone who's settling on their dregs, someone who's been saying later for too long, someone who needs to hear that God's patience has an expiration date, but his mercy is still available right now. Second, write in the comments. What struck you most about this story? Was it the origin, the wine, the erasure, or the fact that Ruth's one yes outweighed a nation's 1,000-year no? And third, subscribe, because we're going to keep telling the stories that don't get told in church. The uncomfortable ones, the ones with caves and blood, and a God whose mercy is as fierce as his judgment. The stories that change you. I'll see you in the next one.